Andrew, please turn on the recording. Recording started.
Thank you. Good morning. This is Jason Orm of the Oregon Board of Accountancy Laws and Rules Committee. I'm calling this public meeting of the Laws and Rules Committee to order. Today is Monday, August 19th, 2024, and the time is 9:04 a.m. This meeting is being recorded. We have quorum to start this meeting, and we are expecting additional members and guests to join us. The meeting is a hybrid in-person meeting held at the offices of the OSCPA with a Zoom participation option. If you are participating on Zoom, please be sure to mute your mic. When you want to speak, please raise your hand if you're in person. If on Zoom, either raise your hand so that I can see it on your screen or use the virtual raise your hand option. Committee members, liaisons, and support staff can speak at any time. Members of the public observing, please use the public comment opportunity for any comment you may have unless specifically called upon. In addition, members of the public are limited to 3 minutes of comment, and the chair reserves the right to terminate comment if the comment does not pertain to the issues the committee is considering. Please do not use the chat room for any discussions. Should any technical issues arise, we will pause the meeting until they are resolved. I will now take a roll call of members and guests. Jason Orm, Chair, to my left.
Sherry McPherson.
Across the table.
Andrew Barlow. Martin Piccioni, Executive Director.
Beth.
Beth Spencer, CLA, committee member.
Amanda Fells, committee member.
Jason. Yeah.
Jason Robinson, board liaison.
Andrew.
Angie, you're still on mute.
Yeah, for some reason my computer wouldn't let me unmute. I'm Angie Hunt, board legal counsel.
Thank you. And then we also have with us Dominic.
Good morning. I'm Dominic Frenzel. I'm the executive officer for the California Board of Accountancy.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Rachel.
Rachel Reardon from PwC attending as a guest.
All right. Thank you very much to all here. Is there anyone that I missed? Hearing none. Move to the draft agenda. Has everyone had an opportunity to review the agenda?
Yes.
Yes. Motion? I would accept a motion to accept the agenda as presented.
So moved.
Moved by Sherry, second.
Second.
Second by Amanda. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, motion passes. New business. We have been busy. Thanks to Angie for doing the draft. I hope everyone had a chance to look at the draft of the proposed statute. That this is draft 1 by Angie that will then go through a process. Let's see, who do we have joining us?
It's Jennifer from the Washington Board.
Let's give her just a moment. Jennifer, welcome.
Hello.
With Jennifer, we have guests from both the Washington Board and California Board of Accountancy. Martin, do you want to go through and just summarize the meeting, the 17th meeting, and the update on the national status?
Yeah, I'll just do that very briefly. I think the simplest way to summarize the board meeting on the 17th is that there really was no disagreement between the Laws and Rules Committee recommendations that came out of the July meeting at the board meeting. So the board basically embraced in full what was recommended out of LRC and directed us to start drafting. And it was a pretty full discussion because, as you may recall, at the July 17 Laws and Rules Committee meeting, we had our first really in-depth discussion, not our first discussion, but our first really in-depth discussion around moving away from de-emphasizing things like substantial equivalency and emphasizing the concept of open mobility. For licensure, that's probably the biggest shift, and as well as the move away from emphasizing, kind of, if you will, the older approach to strict semester hours and moving away to a more flexible version of bachelor +1, master's +2. So that was, I think, a really important signal that we continue to have a lot of unity in Oregon around what it is that we want to do. Which is important because the other part of my update is that we're still really far away from that at the national level. We just are. It remains very fluid. I think some of you may recall that I was somewhat optimistic and hopeful at the end of that meeting, which is partially my error because I am somewhat incorrigible when it comes to my level of optimism. And I was optimistic at the time, if you may recall, because there was a UAA committee meeting that was scheduled for August 2nd, where I was somewhat hopeful that maybe there would be a greater meeting of the minds. And you may recall more substantively that I felt like there was a greater level of unity that was emerging nationally, at least around, can you please just focus on how we protect mobility, kind of as the first emphasis. And even though at that time there was no unity on how to do that, it seemed like there was some level of coalescing that was occurring, right? And I unfortunately have to say, it does not look like, based on what we're hearing, that the UAA committee meeting led to any kind of a commonality or path forward around this piece. So nationally, I think we are not just fractured, but I also am obligated to report, because I do not want to hide this from the committee, that I will say, to my disappointment, last week we had a call from the executive directors. That is essentially a regular monthly call that all the executive directors of all the regulatory boards are on. And those calls include NASPA staff. And this was really the first time where we openly heard requests, essentially, if you will, from up, that effectively asked us to slow, and us, I mean, all executive directors, not just Oregon us, but it was clearly also with a view toward Oregon, to essentially slow down the move toward the state houses. Right. And I was, quite frankly, rather honest on the call that I believe that, based on where we are at with our momentum and the direction that I have from the board now, that the board is highly unlikely to embrace a slowing down of this process. Because if there's anything that I've heard from the board before in our prior level discussions, it is a disappointment that it will take us until January 1, 2026 on the current pathway to really start having a significant impact. And the board already feels that it's too late. That was the message kind of at the board level. And I don't know, I mean, Jason, you're here as Jason Robinson. So I know there's two Jasons here, so I have to be clear who I'm talking to. Jason, with your board liaison hat on, you want to just either verify or add to that, because that's kind of, I feel like, fundamentally the message that I've so far gotten.
I thought it was pretty clear. It was full steam ahead.
Yeah.
So
I made that pretty clear, They are essentially trying to make a process argument now that the new process is just starting. Professional licensure task force is still developing stuff, and there is a regional update that I don't yet know the team that is now just scheduled a webinar for Thursday with the latest update from the task force. So we will actually have that update at the board meeting that was actually moved. The special board meeting to consider what we're doing today was actually moved coincidentally to Monday of next week, which turned out to be very lucky because the webinar on the professional licensure task force would have conflicted with our board meeting. So we kind of lucked out on that one. But bottom line is we now operate the rest of this process with a heightened degree of certainty that we will not get lucky and have some kind of a national consensus language emerge anytime soon. So we're gonna have to try to do the very best we can. I'm really glad that we have, Jennifer and Dominic here. I want to publicly acknowledge, because I don't know if he'll be able to join, that Tom Neal, who is the AICPA side co-chair of the UAA committee, has been extremely generous with advice and counsel our way. It's just that any advice that he's giving us, any help that he's giving us on the language side, I cannot present as consensus language because there is no consensus language. So that's kind of where we are. And from my perspective, what that means is we need to keep on trucking the way we have. Publicly, transparently, having Rachel, thank you for being here, making sure that TAC knows exactly what we're doing in terms of doing the utmost that we can to protect mobility, that we keep Washington and California close because it still looks like those two states may well end up doing something very close to what we're trying to do. Maybe not in the exact same time frame, but there's a lot of conversations and commonality going on. And I also understand that the same thing may be true of Nevada. So there's a number of states on the West Coast that are in close conversation, and I need to be fully accountable both to them and invite them in, as well as to NASBA and to AICPA, because effectively what we're starting to do is not just with an eye toward Oregon, it's also with an eye toward, if we get this right, then there is a possibility that is greater than normal that other jurisdictions may look to what we are doing and say, this could be a model for us. So that's essentially kind of the evolution of the strategic context just in the last month, since the July 17 meeting. So it's a little bit of heady stuff, but that's probably the way that I would kind of summarize the first two bullets under item 3A on the board meeting and the national discussion stuff. And I don't know if either you, Sherry, or Jason, if there is, or anyone else really that has any information on the AICPA side, where I will be fully transparent. I'm not sure I fully understand where AICPA is at in this process. I hear different things. If anyone has any updates, news around AICPA that they feel would be helpful for this committee, please share.
I don't feel like there's been any adjustment since May council meeting.
Right, and we'll be in council again in October,
Okay,
which is 2 months away, and the way this is moving and changing and shifting.
Yeah.
I don't know.
The biggest thing is the NPAG, National Pipeline Advisory Group's
Yeah.
report has been, completed, so it's no longer a draft. But other than that, nothing, no new conversations.
So
All right.
Martin,
Yeah.
Was there a reason that they gave for why they want us to slow down?
Yeah, so the reason is the way it was formulated. was to essentially, since the UAA process is just starting now and needs input from the professional licensure task force, right? They essentially said it will take, there's two arguments. Number one was a process argument, right? That essentially the UAA doesn't really have yet all the information that data needs to work. This will take longer. That was one argument. The second one was, and that's a little bit painful to discuss. I'll do this as gently as I can. There was a brief, very informal survey that was run by my esteemed colleague from Texas, that basically just surveyed jurisdictions at a super high level of, are you moving toward, some additional licensure pathway of some version of 120+2? Yes, or no, or other, right? There were about roughly 33, 34 responses. Out of those responses, there were 9 affirmative, we are absolutely adding an additional pathway. There were 16 that fell in the other category of, being somewhere in between, wait and see. And then there were, I think about roughly 8 or 9 that were in the firm, or at least what looked initially to be the firm, no, we're not considering anything. We're sticking, we're sticking to what we have. And that survey was turned into an argument that there's only a small minority of states, i.e. less than jurisdictions, i.e. less than 10, that are moving forward to this. And this was then turned into an argument of, we should just slow down because there's really just a small minority here that's actually doing this. There was a significant amount of pushback, I think, against that idea of interpreting the data that way. I think a somewhat gentle or not so gentle pointing out that a lot of the 16 are simply on the fence and could simply start moving the moment that, quite frankly, we've had movements in state houses already. So there was, quite frankly, a disagreement on presenting this data as somehow there's just a minority level interest in changes. So it was not an easy meeting because of that, but it's a fuller explanation of the two of your question, Jason, around what the arguments were made. So 2 arguments. One, that we're allegedly in a minority. I respectfully disagree that it's, the small minority thing, but I think there is a very significant amount of interest from, I think, well over 20, if not close to 30 jurisdictions, which is quite frankly over half. They're at least considering it, right? Which is, that ain't nothing. So that's my take on that data. And then the other one was when I specifically spoke up and said, I don't think I can sell a slowdown to my board, then I got the process argument that I laid out earlier. So that's the more specific answer to your question, Jason. I hope that helps.
It does. I appreciate that, Martin.
Okay. Another bullet, which is an OSCPA update. Is there anything else that we need to talk about OSCPA wise in terms of developments?
On OSCPA, no further developments. Our next board meeting is September 19th.
Yeah. Okay. And let's see here, Amanda, is there anything OAI side that either has changed or that we should know about committee side before we dive into the deep dive into the fund language?
No, there's no further updates. Our next board meeting is in October.
Okay, and I think I'm trying to wake my computer back up, Jason, but you have the agenda in front of you. Was there anything else we had on the agenda as
No.
anything contextual that we need to discuss?
I don't.
Oh, the drafting update. very briefly, this is actually, I always like ending every section on a little bit of good news, because this I realized was just a little bit depressing just now. We have, so if, I think the committee's aware that there's actually 2 legislative proposals from the board that are heading to the session, right? We're doing all the hard lifting on the big one, which is the what I'll simply call the updates to the Public Accountancy Act in Oregon, right? We also are working on a much smaller, much more focused concept that's really a money concept that has to do with scholarship funding and grant. And the only reason I bring that up here is because the process with that particular piece of legislation drafting has really affirmed that we are in an extremely blessed and lucky space with legislative counsel this time. We have an excellent drafter who's very open to feedback, giving us multiple opportunities to work on drafts informally before they make a formal drafting proposal that we have to react to. So it's been a really, really good experience with legislative counsel so far. She's also been very willing to accommodate our delayed schedule, because you may recall back in like at the May meeting, I was still under the impression that I had to have stuff in by essentially June 30th. That this process would have to be done by June 30th, right? And we've gotten a lot more flexibility on when we need to get our text in. So she's both giving us more time and more opportunity. And that really bodes well for this process, especially with what we're about to get into here, which is a much broader, and bless you, Angie, for trying to tackle that, kind of a much cleaner, kind of a rewrite of our licensing statutes. There is going to be stuff that is going to bleed over another section of statute we then have to update. There's a lot of details and kind of moving parts, which will probably take a few go-rounds to catch them all, right? And so I feel just super blessed that something as complex with as many moving parts as we have here is actually gonna end up with a ledge counsel drafter who is sympathetic, cooperative, collaborative. Those are all really that bodes super well for us being able to get something really decent before the legislature, notwithstanding the national environment, that I think we still have a shot that maybe we don't need to amend what comes out of here, right? Which would be really nice. That's a tall order given all what we're all talking about, but I still think we have that shot. So that's my positive note in terms of ledge counsel drafting. That part I think looks very promising. That's all I have. So I think we're ready for item B.
I would like to ask one question of Jason Robinson. We've discussed a number of things so far. From your standpoint, representing the board, we're still moving ahead, correct?
That is correct.
So Angie, Mark and I met and talked through a wide variety of things. One thing you will not notice in the draft is the changes to legislation with regard to firms themselves. What we decided, we got through this, and at the end decided that to do both the licensees and the firm piece that we've also discussed here, that is, the current language is somewhat confusing. We're going to put that off and focus on this piece first and get this piece done, rather than try to get both pieces through this legislature. So Angie went through, took what we have talked about, drafted the language that you have that Martin sent out late last week. It's I like it a lot because it's clear, it's simple. In the executive summary, you can obtain a license in the state of Oregon under this draft statute with 150 semester credit hours plus a year of experience, which with a bachelor's degree from an accredited university with at least 2 years of experience, or with a master's degree from an accredited university with at least 1 year of experience. So 3 pathways. We included the 150 in the language just so that if somebody's part way in between and they're close to their 150, but they've only got a bachelor's, they don't have a master's, they can still license after a year, just like the old rules, if they hit the 150 mark. So we left that in. So I would say, let's just walk through the sections, respond to questions, have discussion about the sections. And move from there. Martin, do you agree?
Yeah, and I think we're gonna also quite frankly ask you some both policy and language questions
Yes.
throughout. I am also getting feedback from others, and I encourage, whether it's Jennifer or Dominic or Rachel, guests, where we're trying to be very open and collaborative. Yes, it's a public meeting where guests are observing, but if you have something that you feel like, we are either missing or where you have something to contribute, please go off mute and raise your hand, and we're happy to take feedback from non-committee members as well. That is very much the way we designed this process to work.
And Martin, Dominic, Rachel, and Jennifer all have this draft statutory language. Is that correct?
I believe so, because I do think I sent it out to everybody on the public mailing list. So it's actually a very public draft that at least I think 60 people have.
Okay.
And I see a thumbs up from Dominic. He's very sophisticated on the tech stuff. He knows how to do that. I have to learn a thumbs up. And I believe Jennifer has it. And I'm pretty sure Rachel has it as well.
Okay. So let's walk through the draft together. And again, I can't imagine writing see, Rachel's got the tech going too. She's got the thumbs up. Jennifer, now there's peer pressure for you to be able to figure it out too.
And not be old school and just say I have it.
That works.
So for the recording record, that's the voice of Jennifer Seawood, State of Washington.
Appreciate Angie doing this drafting to take what we talked about and then put it into language like this. Took lots of time. We've teased Martin already about the bill she's going to send him. So the first section, 050, qualification to sit. We made a modification here. Remember, this is what we did a year ago and got through session to where you could sit at 120 hours. We've changed that to sit with a bachelor's degree. The reason we made that change is because there are universities around the country who are talking about issuing bachelor's degrees in cases where there's less than 120 semester hours. And we backed it up by saying bachelor's degree from an accredited university. So if the accreditation organizations agree that this is a bachelor's degree, even though it's less than 120 hours, we're not going to fuss with that. Okay. It's interesting to me, and I will admit my ignorance, I didn't know this. You can sit for the exam as a PA with a high school degree and 2 years of experience, which we only have about 20 PAs in the state, don't we, Martin? Roughly?
In fact, I can tell you exactly based on research that was done by the gentleman to my right, who's a wonderful data sleuth, Andrew. I can confirm we have exactly 20 PAs in the state, and within that, I also know for other reasons that there is exactly one PA left, exactly one. That is both grandfathered in to still do audits and actually doing audits. There's a few that have that grandfathering privilege, but they're actually no longer exercising.
So you look at that and say, there's 20 left, why are we making a fuss about this? Why did we, leave it in? And the discussion we had is that another part of pipeline where from a tax standpoint or from an audit staff standpoint, I'm stretching out just a staff, they're not issuing reports, they're not, why can't PAs do that work? An unlicensed staff person can work on an audit, they're not signing a report. Same thing on tax returns. Maybe this gives us some more opportunities to have people in the profession without a college degree. Kind of interesting, I think.
Jason, just one point of clarification, and Angie, you're probably waiting for me to do that. I want to be fully transparent with the group here that the language in front of you is not news when it comes to the high school piece. This is essentially taken from our current statute. So this is not something we're creating out of whole cloth. It's simply something we're not deleting out of an option that we currently have on the books. Okay. What I do want to say, because I don't want to gloss over it, because I don't expect anyone, because frankly, it came as a surprise to me, right? So I would certainly not expect anyone else to have picked up on this. The way the current language is written, and you don't see that as clearly because Angie blessed us with a much cleaner and easier to read draft, right? The way the current PA language is written actually requires, based on legal analysis that Angie has done, would actually require 3 years of supervised experience rather than 2 years. We, for now, and I'm doing some checking on the back end, right? I'm not sure that that's on folks' radar, and I'm not convinced that that's necessarily in alignment with how other states are running PA licensure. So I'm going to do a little bit of comparative research. I'm going to try to figure out a way to get this done this week so that by the time the board meeting occurs on Monday, that hopefully you have some indication as to whether we are aligning with the 2 years or whether we're somehow need to go back to the 3 years we originally had in there. It wasn't very clear on the existing language because it was kind of in 2 different sections and it said 2 years here and 1 year there. And we kind of at the staff level had assumed that the 1 year is really part of the 2 years. And then Andrew said, no, it's not. So there's a little bit of a, first of all, a benefit that we have much cleaner, easier to read language now at a minimum, right? I still have a little bit of work to do to figure out whether the switch from 3 years of experience to 2 years of supervised experience, how that aligns with how other states are dealing with PA licensure.
Thank you for that clarification. The high school piece was in statute. I just didn't know about it. Yeah, kind of interesting. So questions on 050, comments? Hearing none, 060. You have to sit for the exam. And here, I don't think we made significant changes. I turn to Angie because we've got a clean draft without all the red lines. But you'll notice that there is language as prescribed by board rule so that the board's got a little bit of ability by rule. And this goes back into licensure when we're accepting people from other states. We want to give the board ability by rule to put up some guardrails. If another state does something really outrageous, I sit I sit as a candidate in Utah. And Utah allows a passing score to be 52%. They don't, but let's say they did. Okay, we probably wouldn't be comfortable with that. So it gives the board by rule, the ability to say, no, pass is 75. I think nationwide, it's standard, is it not, at 75%, Martin?
Yeah, I don't know of any way that a state could right now set a different same standard than what, because I think it's AICPA that's grading. And so I don't know that there is a way for a state to say we have a different passing level, but it's essentially, it's a caveat just in case.
Angie, anything that I missed on 060 that's different?
No, it's generally just kind of like, I just kind of made it, a little bit easier to read and just kind of like wanted to clarify on the PA side, that they take different, they take only certain sections of it. And so, that would be in rule, the sections they need to pass versus what a CPA needs to pass all of them. So.
And on that note, just a reminder to the committee, we've already finished our rulemaking, taking the required sections of the CPA exam from 3 sections down to 2 sections, aligning that part with what happens with PA licensure in other jurisdictions. So we already have that in rule and we're not planning on changing that, but it's also good to not pull that into statute at that level of detail. Just keep the authority to define it in rule.
I like the point of, pointing it or directing towards rule.
Yeah.
That way, as things change, we're nimble,
Yes,
thinking in light of the recent overhaul of the CPA exam.
yes. Anything else on 060? 075, credit for exam taken in other states. Mark pointed out some of the historic administrative burden that's been here. And so what we've done is strive to get rid of that administrative burden. When I sat for the exam, I sat in Utah as an Oregon candidate. What this language does is I sat in Utah, Oregon says, okay, we'll give you credit for sitting in Utah for those sections that you passed. Because it's the same exam, it's the same national exam, the same passing standard. Why not?
So I do have a comment that kind of mirrors back in a few other places too. Should it be jurisdiction, not states?
I've asked that question of Angie when we were doing our offline work. Do you want to just take that one on, Angie, in terms of our struggles with state versus jurisdiction?
So I think I was just going to put consistently state. I'm not sure if there is like on the Ledge Council side of it, they might have. I was thinking actually probably that is where they might come in about how they want it written there. But I guess maybe share what you're thinking of is the issue with Puerto Rico and.
Yeah, Guam, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, and frankly, DC.
DC.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we can fiddle with that. We'll figure out what term to use for sure to make sure that is correct.
It was one of those things that it reflects later on in the other sections as well.
Yes, it may very well be an issue where we have to do a definition of state in the rule.
Right.
This is jurisdictions and common, because we also have a Commonwealth of Massachusetts, right,
Yes.
which is not a state, it's a Commonwealth, right? So there's all these niceties out there. But I think most likely Ledge Council will tell us what term we must use, and then we have to define that term in rule, saying, state for purposes of this means any Commonwealth, state, jurisdiction, blah, 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 territory, whatever that definition looks like.
I was wondering about that, whether that might be more clean too, but.
Yeah.
It's always on my radar, sorry.
Oh, no, we talked about that because of the territories, and I can't remember if it was Martin or Angie who brought up District of Columbia.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you're not a state. All right, anything else on 075? Hearing none. 095. So same language. But you'll notice in 1A, B, and C. Bachelor's +2, master's +1, 150 +1. So that we incorporate the current path plus add another. Or another 2 if the master's degree doesn't have 150 hours. The experience under C. Oh, we've got. Sorry, Angie, just, we've got 2 Cs under 1.
I know, I thought I had fixed all that before I sent it over, but yeah, I've already fixed it on my draft, so I don't know what happened. There was a couple of the lettering that didn't somehow get saved, but I got it.
So, and experience has to be verified by public accountant or CPA or chartered accountant who's licensed in good standing in this state or another jurisdiction. There's your jurisdiction language here. And has been licensed for a minimum period of time set by board rule. So the board has the ability to wiggle that around a little bit. Yep.
You know, just Angie, well, what the language that Jason just read. I know, I mean, because we're also trying to deal with folks that are coming in internationally who may get their supervision outside the United States, which currently is, you know, very much allowed in our construct, including supervision by chartered accountants outside the USA. I know we use the term chartered accountant here, so that's good, right? But does the language in sub A limit us here with respect to, because it specifically says this state or another jurisdiction? Because I almost could make an argument that it says that it would have, that the supervision can only occur inside the United States, which is currently, we allow supervision to occur that counts toward licensure to occur outside the United States.
So I'm just double checking. I'm 95% sure that I just took that straight from the statute as it's written currently. I'm just checking to make sure I'm not.
And I'm not saying we have to amend the language. I just want to make sure we don't shut down any options that we have.
Right. No, I know that's what I'm gonna make sure because I wasn't sure either, like, you know, when I was anyhow.
Feel like a big four base internationally.
Let's see. Sorry, just take me a second.
Don't get a ton of folks that get their supervision in outside, but it's not a non-issue.
Yeah. More and more global too.
Mhm. Quiet as Angie's looking.
Yeah, that's what it says right now. So I think I was just kind of assuming if that's already what we're doing. I'm not sure. But that's something we can, you know, when we're looking at that term, we just want to make sure that that allows anybody to come in.
You think we would have the ability in the rule to define jurisdiction in such a way that it could be a jurisdiction outside the US?
Right, is what I'm guessing. That's how we get there now. I don't know. I mean,
I always like to assume that we have a legal foundation what's in our rules now. It's one of my happy places.
So if we are thinking jurisdiction includes the international, does that then change the conversation about examinations taken in other states just a little bit? Because if we say jurisdiction, because it doesn't specifically say the US uniform accountancy exam or whatever, although that would be defined in rule, we wouldn't be accepting any other kind of exam from an international jurisdiction.
Versus what I think what you're trying to say is, but we would accept, because there is a ton of international administrations of the US CPA exam.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, it just, we should make sure that we say somewhere in rule that it needs to be the US CPA exam. Because in statute, it says must pass a CPA examination adopted by the board as a condition of licensure. So that's gonna cover that, right?
Right, yep.
Yeah, okay, good.
So, can you please share what is the current rule under 095? It's 150 and 2 years. There's one path right now?
Right, so this is all, so there actually is no 095, that doesn't exist right now in statute at all. So basically what I was doing was what I took and tried to do was take it out of what the way that it's, if you look at the current statute, it's like all over the place. So like you have like requirements, you know, and to sit for the exam, and then you have these other ones, and then everybody's, and they would, and because of the fact that we have the PAs, the way that it was done was just trying to like shove all these different things into. I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it, but it's just very confusing the way it's written currently. So what I tried to do was take it out of this whole idea of like this, you know, getting a certificate. Like, so I think if you look back to the history of before, it was like, first you would apply to sit for the exam, and then you'd be issued a certificate, and then you would have your certificate, and then you would apply for your permit, and you would get a permit. And so anyhow, I basically just tried to like take away all that sort of confusion, and just basically like, you apply to sit for the exam. Once you've completed the exam and you've passed all sections, then you apply for licensure, and tried to like streamline that. And so we ended up, so in doing that, I had to add other statutory sections that aren't there.
And then Melissa, I think the other piece that I think your question was trying to get to is like, what's our pathway now? Right? And the pathway now, substantively, is the one that is essentially the foundation of substantial equivalency, right? The one that all states are supposed to have, which is 150 semester hours plus a minimum of 1 year of supervised experience, right? That's the current pathway to initial licensure in Oregon. That is the pathway to licensure in all other jurisdictions right now. And what we're trying to do is essentially add on additional options while making it very clear that we're not throwing out what's essentially the current foundation of that every jurisdiction has in common in terms of how to get to initial licensure, that it's an add, not a replace.
Well, I feel like this is a humongous change to me to consider a pathway that has less than 2 years of experience. And so, no, I know that I got my initial license with 1 year of experience, but I just would like to hear some discussion about how people feel about 1 year of experience versus 2 years of experience, because our profession has just gotten more and more complicated. And so we're basically lowering the bar in the state of Oregon for experience in some pathways.
So we've always just had 1 year of experience required in Oregon.
Yeah, that's the current experience requirement. That's what everyone's actually undoing, and adding the 2 years plus bachelor. That's what the conversation's about. Because currently, all over the United States, the requirement is 150 in 1 year. And it has been that way for 40 to 20 years, depending on which state you're in, or California might be 7 or 8 years. So that isn't the change.
Well, actually, let me add to that a little bit to kind of address your concern, Melissa. So yes, let's start with where Beth started off, right? Right now, everybody has 150 plus 1 year's worth of supervised experience, right? Now the discussion is, do we want more supervised experience, but drop essentially the, if you will, this, you know, awful label of the 30 empty credits that don't have a specific assignment that essentially the profession added on when it was originally a 120 model. So in that sense, the conversation is about adding more supervision, but kind of in lieu of the 30, right? There's actually a second conversation that is also happening nationally within that, right? And the second conversation is, and this is the part where kind of the disagreement comes in. Part of the disagreement comes in between at the national level, which is that unlike Oregon, and I have to really emphasize this, unlike Oregon and to a pretty significant extent, Washington and I believe California as well, right? We have a system, when we think about supervised experience and what that means, it doesn't mean the same thing all across the country. And it's really, really important to know that. So everything that you've been really used to, Melissa, in Oregon around, hey, we have these 7 competencies that we require to be accomplished, that we require, you know, the supervised individual to sign off on having achieved those accomplishments, that we ask the supervising licensee to sign off on all those pieces. We put a whole structure in place around supervision that does not exist in many other jurisdictions. In many other jurisdictions, there is simply, if you will, a time clock approach, is that once you've practiced X amount of time, after meeting the education requirement, you've met essentially the supervised experience requirement, right? So we're kind of ahead of where folks are. That actually right now helps us a little bit in that fractured national environment, because part of what NASBA is doing is trying to not just have this discussion about a 2-year model. They actually call it, I think, a 120 + 1 + 1 right now, which is kind of their way of essentially emphasizing that they want very specific things to occur in certain ways that they haven't yet defined. We still don't know yet what exactly that should look like, right? Because they want a lot more structure as part of the supervised experience, right? In that sense, even though we still don't know what it is that they're actually going to put on the table, they're kind of moving the national discussion in the direction where Oregon and Washington and California already are, at least with respect to wanting some type of standards and markers to occur inside the supervised experience. Now we're, quite frankly, pretty far away from the very specific instructional pieces that I think NASBA is contemplating to occur inside that model that they're developing. But we are certainly already there when it comes to having markers inside our supervised experience, right? In all honesty, that to me means that I remain, and this is also important for Rachel here on this call to hear, that is one of the reasons why I remain pretty optimistic that from a standard of NASBA or other jurisdictions looking at, is Oregon still substantially equivalent, right? If they're looking in part, especially on the NASBA side, on do they have standards for supervised experience, you're not going to read that in here, but they know that we've had them for decades. In fact, they've taken a look at our stuff pretty closely to see what they can glean for some of their ideas around the PLTF. So that's kind of a little bit of the broader background around where the kind of supervision related discussion is at, kind of at the national level, with, quite frankly, no consensus amongst the jurisdiction as to what supervised experience should look like. The only thing that we know in Oregon for sure is that we are pretty far ahead of the rest of the game, you know, and I'm exempting our dear guests here from Washington and California, with respect to having a set of requirements around what supervised experience means and the types of competencies that need to be developed during supervised experience. Does that help, Melissa?
Yes, it does. And so right now we're at 1 first letter C.
make sure. Yes.
And
That's-
so what we're doing is Angie's doing a great job by pulling this out and making it more easily accessible to people about what the requirements are. And we're also adding A and B.
Correct.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Okay.
It's nice to have it contained,
Oh,
where
it's-
you don't have to.
Oh, this, I love the drafting. I hope, Angie, I hope Ledge Council takes it and goes, oh, boy, this is awesome. I'll make a couple of tweaks on what a state is or versus jurisdiction and
We're done.
It's like compared to our current statutory text, it's like having 3 sets of bifocals on your eyes.
We also have 2 number 2s, which I'm sure Angie already saw.
yeah, we do.
We do.
Yeah.
It's so weird because I fixed all of this and so I don't know. I even like double check that it's saved and whatever. I don't know.
Well, there's the problem.
Just kidding. I really only take back.
I've had some, I don't, you know, I'm technologically challenged, that's for sure.
Any other discussion with regard to 095? Hearing none.
Pardon me.
Yes,
Sorry, this is Dominic Franzella with the California Board of Accountancy. Can I just offer I just have a quick question or thought, if that's okay, Chair?
please go ahead, Dominic.
So on your 095 first C, the one that's kind of the legacy pathway, presumably.
Yep.
I guess my question is, one, is it a legacy pathway to maintain a kind of a grandfather approach to it, or second to it, going back to a comment you had made early on in removing unit kind of requirements with a kind of forward thinking look about impacts of, say, less than 120 semester unit degree programs. By maintaining this unit number in here, 150, if a college ever moves to say a 90 degree pathway or degree option, an individual may have 60 units they're going to need to kind of fill back out in a kind of a post 30 unit environment. So I don't know if that's kind of something you want to add, maybe 150 or its equivalent, or something to that effect to keep that kind of 30 unit thought process in place. So that's just a concern or a question I would have when we maintain units. I know it's something we're cognizant of in California and just trying to get rid of units.
Thank you, Dominic. But we talked about that, and that 150 is really there for the legacy candidates, for the ones that are in the pipeline now. 10 years from now, I don't think anybody will be licensing under the 150. They'll be bachelor's or master's. But we were concerned, like I think I heard you say about the person who's kind of in the middle right now, who's got 135 credits. Well, if they get 15 more credits, they can be licensed after a year. So we're trying to accommodate them. Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, and I think as a legacy pathway, I think it works well. I was just more concerned if it stays for like in a longer term solution to the problem, keeping units in could create a kind of a disconnect for that pathway going forward. But I think otherwise, I think it looks good.
Yeah, and we agree with you on the keeping credits in because of what universities are doing. And that's why we went to the bachelor's and master's accredited universities to get around that whole issue. We agree with you.
Angie,
Thank
does it make sense to take the word, and I'm sorry, Dominic, I didn't want to talk over you.
No, I just wanted to say thank you for acknowledging me and giving me a chance to offer a suggestion.
Happy to, thank you.
Thank you.
Super helpful, and thank you for all the, consults that you and I have already had around all these topics. Angie, does it make any sense at all based on what we just discussed, specifically looking at the first 1C that we just discussed, line 2, where it says or more? And instead of saying or more, say or equivalent?
Well, that's, or more, that has to do with the 1 year or more, that's the experience.
No, that's the second or more. There's another or more.
Oh, right. I mean, you know, I think that was like what Jason was just saying, that the whole reason, you know, this was just here purely for those people that have been, you know, around and have been down this path, and not to try and expand that past.
Okay,
That is because this was really focusing on those people that are like, we're focusing on the people that are already like looking at this from like, we need these 150 hours. We've already done these 150 hours versus the first one, which allows you to have the wiggle room.
yeah. Okay.
I need Angie or Martin to, I would like to also request comments from Jennifer and Rachel on this section, if that is appropriate. If it's not appropriate, Angie will tell me no. I'm curious to see what you think, and Dominic, if you want to chime back in with any comments, because really this is the big piece of the change.
Yeah. Well, 1C isn't, but the whole
A and
way, this is one on the licensing side, which I know I don't want to speak for Rachel and PwC here. You know, I understand that the message from TAC is more about not wanting to get involved in the specifics of licensure pathways, and it's really more about what we're about to discuss with open mobility. But I certainly, if I'm wrong on that, Rachel, please speak up. But you know, the real issue here is what we're doing here is something that's we know it's gonna concern NASPAR. I mean, let's just be honest about that, right? We know that, but really more from a sense of moving in kind of as much of a unison direction, right? Is this language causing concern over on the Washington side, on the California side, right? Because what we're trying to do is have something where we can all kind of mutually say we're kind of on board, moving roughly in the same direction. And that's really the fundamental question here around 673.095. Does it kind of maintain us on that? Let's try to walk this, you know, and I know that Dominic, you're going to be bound by your board. Jennifer, same thing for you, right? It's really more about, you know, does this give us a decent chance that we can maintain some level of walking together?
Yeah, this is Rachel Reardon here. I agree, Martin, thanks for that. We are, from the PwC perspective, just watching what the states are doing, and like you said, our main focus is on mobility or a safe harbor of some sort, rather than what individual states are doing. We're obviously interested in watching, but our feedback comes more on the mobility piece.
And Rachel, if you are able to stay on with us as we get through that piece, I would welcome your comments to the extent that you can are in a position to make them on what we've done.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that.
Dominic has his hand up.
Oh, Dominic does that. See, he's got that whole cool raise your hand thing. So go to Dominic.
Thank you. And I think Martin knows that for all intents and purposes, A and B in your new proposed 095 are substantially similar. I'm going to avoid the word substantial equivalency because it seems to be, fraught with, it's basically verboten nowadays when you're talking about NASBA and others. But I would say A and B are consistent with where we're headed in California. We anticipate our language will be coming out next month in similar kind of approach, and even taking a similar approach to what your council has done, is trying to break apart the exam, the licensure, the experience requirements, so that they are more standalone sections that allow for more flexibility and readability and understandability going forward.
Okay. Thank you. Jennifer?
I am Jennifer with Washington State, and I think from our perspective, our board we're not wanting to be probably ahead of everything, so we're watching closely what the Oregon board's doing, California board, and that's kind of some language we've shown, and your AMB definitely mirrors that, and so I think that's the way our board may be looking towards, and staying away from the 120 and the 150 language. But right now, I think for our board, we're just mainly concentrating on, I'm trying to decouple and looking at the mobility piece, so that when you guys get ready and get this into the fact that we make sure that there's some mobility between, your licensees and the coming here in Washington. So we have no concerns the way this looks at this point. This is probably what we're looking at for our board as well. This is what I'll be sharing with our board. So appreciate that.
Thank you. And the feedback is wonderful. Thank you. So let's start. We didn't close up, wait a minute. Oh, there we go.
Hello. Yes, so one thing that I would like to comment on as well that I don't think has been brought up, even though it's covered by this, I think by leaving in, I know that this 150+1 has been talked about as grandfathering language, but I think the other thing that it does is it preserves the method that some universities are already using to help students get there. So like, for example, I didn't do a master's, I did a post-baccalaureate certificate. So I have a post-bac certificate in accounting, so which I was able to do as an undergrad without having to go the graduate method. And so because these schools already have these programs built in, it allows them to continue being functional. Whereas, rather than saying, okay, well, no, it either has to be master's or not. I think since our intention is to add pathways and not add flexibility for universities without forcing them to kind of restructure their existing programs, I think this preserves that. So I'm really glad that we're leaving that in.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. Other comments? Hearing none. 100, which is licenses of PA. So pass the ethics exam, and I think, Angie, is this consistent with what is already in statute?
Pretty much, other than the 1 year. So this is where, when Martin was talking before about how PAs, basically where we would have 3 years is what the statute would require. So before, up top where it says to sit for the exam, you needed 2 years. And then here there was an additional year that was required in this portion. And then the only other sort of major changes to this is just the terminology. So sort of getting away from using, a lot of those terms of permit and things like that, and just basically being like, all of these things are licenses. They're two different licenses. You can get a CPA or a PA, and this is the PA, and this is what you need to do for that versus the one above, which is for CPA.
And we deleted that one additional sentence with regard to this had it, and it was confusing, and Angie was patient with me to the extent she could be. As I said, well, I'm reading that differently, and we got to banter about statute a little bit. So right now, as I understand it, a PA can be licensed. They have to have 2 years of experience to sit for the exam. They sit for and pass the exam. They pass the ethics exam. And then they submit their application and can be licensed. Correct, Angie?
Yes, so this doesn't require that additional year anymore, but if Martin goes out and finds out that everybody's doing it that other way, then we'll put it back in. We just weren't sure what the sort of standard was around that.
Right, there's still some legal history that is being looked at to know where we are on that. Questions? Okay, moving to 140, reciprocity. So we made, I think we made some changes here. It's simple, it simplifies it. So you submit an application, pass the ethics exam, pay a fee, provide evidence that you hold a license issued by a state that has licensing requirements substantially equivalent to Oregon. Or you've been practicing in that state for 4 years or more within the last 10 of the immediately preceding years as a CPA. So if somebody wants to be licensed in Oregon, for example, the person in my office who moved here from Minnesota, there was a process that she had to provide records of states she'd been licensed in, including Ohio, that she hadn't been licensed in for 25 years. And correspondence between the board and their board. This says, nope, she's an active licensee in Minnesota. And she's been practicing in Minnesota for more than 4 years. Within the last 10, she's good to go. And it simplifies that process to be licensed in the state.
And to be clear, the substantial equivalency definition that we're gonna put into statute will include those 3 different pathways as well. So it will be the, master's +1, I'm sorry, bachelor's +2, master's +1, and the 150 +1. So that it basically is sort of saying like, if you come from another state and you have these things, that is what sort of our definition of substantial equivalency will be. So it doesn't get rid of the old one, keeps it, but also adds to it the 2 new ones.
And to be really clear about that, what that means is it is language that absolutely NASBA is not going to like, but it will be extremely clear in welcoming with respect to basically saying very bluntly, and that's in addition to what we're discussing later on in 153 on open mobility, that we will not become a hurdle in Oregon for states that change their licensing requirements to add additional options beyond the 150 +1, the way we are doing, that we're going to be open for business essentially.
Sure.
So this is where I had the jurisdiction point, two places here. I do have a question on B. Is that new language?
Nope.
Okay,
No.
It feels a little confusing to me because I was thinking about this and thinking, okay, so if someone is licensed in, let's just say Delaware, they come, they submit their application. Is this the AICPA open book
If
ethics?
they don't have it on the record yet, so for most people, it's not an issue.
Okay,
Except if their record shows that they came from a state where they never sat for that initial ethics exam for
Okay.
licensure.
so,
It's about a level playing field for us,
okay,
so that we know that everybody who gets an Oregon license has that fundamental 8-hour course
Yeah.
on their record. Most do, but there is a kind of a smaller subset of folks that come in under reciprocity that don't, in which case, quite frankly, taking that exam is not a huge hurdle. It's pretty accessible.
right, and I've worked with that a lot when I was on the
Yeah.
education side of the house. So I was just making sure it was the same one, so it doesn't require that they take it again.
No,
It's just if they had never taken it,
if they already have it on their record, we don't make them retake it.
Okay.
It's an issue of, you need to kind of level playing field.
Yeah.
Because we don't wanna, issue an Oregon license to someone that doesn't have that on their record.
That makes sense. Yeah, thank you for clarification.
We did have, I don't know if this is the right venue, but we did have one applicant in the last year that had to retake it. Because the state did not have a record of it, and a CPA only keeps the record for 5 years.
So yeah, there was a bump that we had there once where there just
makes
wasn't any
sense.
evidence that we could actually find. Right, other than, yes, I took this exam, 47 years ago.
To keep my results.
Yeah, and so that was a bit of a, but that was like, one case in,
Hundreds.
hundreds of reciprocity applications.
Well, it's not an ugly course to take either,
No,
frankly. So, thank you.
So under 140, 1DB, you'll notice that there is language in there. That's the fourth to last 10. As prescribed by board rule, that's providing our board the ability that, excuse me, if the state decides you can, this is Martin's example, I think, I can't remember if he used it in a public meeting, I don't think he did. But if some state decides that you can be a CPA because you've operated a lemonade stand for 2 of the last 3 summers, that our board can say, you know, that's not quite good enough. We don't expect that to ever happen, but that gives our board the ability to say and protect the public and say, no, that's not really what we mean here.
We don't have to take.
We don't have to take everything if it's so. If they're a CPA because they ran a lemonade stand. So. Other questions on 140?
Yeah, so quick
Yes,
comment on that same section, that 1DB. Does it need to say or as prescribed by board rule? Because it doesn't have the or, and so it almost sounds like it's just mimicking what is already in board rule, and so that it could create a contradiction if board rule said something else.
I'm not on mute. Let me look at that. I mean, I think I was just thinking that, I wasn't actually sure exactly how we wanted to get into the specifics of the 4, like, I think what I was thinking about more of like, is that what are those 4 years? Like, because looking at like, who is the person that's like, because we don't get specific in the statute and saying like 4 years doing a certain kind of like, so like, what if you had somebody like, I was just sort of like letting the board get more room so they could actually do something. What do they want from those 4 years? Do they have to be specific like we'd had before where they're supervised and like doing specific things in those 4 years? Or can it just be anything for 4 years is kind of what I was looking at, which I think gets to Jason's point of like, obviously if your 4 years is just working at a lemonade stand, that's probably not enough.
Perfect.
So that's what I was thinking, and not putting or, because the or would open it up more, I think, beyond that, which is why I didn't put or, because I would think that would make it too broad, but you guys tell me, it's not my.
Okay, so the idea is, so rather than giving the board the option to change the 4 of 10 rule, section and rule, the idea is giving the board the option to define what constitutes 4 years of experience.
Right.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, then I think we're good.
Okay. And then Angie, this is probably different on your draft. Under 1A, submits an application in form prescribed by the board. And who? There's an additional there that I think it just can be scratched.
Yeah, it just needs a different lettering. Yeah. Already fixed.
Okay. Anything else under 140? Hearing none. 145, which is the foreign licensure. There's duplicate language here in that first section under 1 on the second, third, fourth, fifth line begins must be satisfied. It's duplicate, at least in the copy I have, Angie. It may have been corrected in yours.
I'm sorry, say that again. I was putting
So,
it.
In that paragraph, 673, 145, there's kind of a thicker paragraph that starts that.
yeah, under 1. And if you go down to the second, third, fourth, fifth line, it starts with must be satisfied.
Satisfied is repeated twice.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yeah.
so that it just needs a little bit of cleanup.
Yeah, not a big deal. So this is for our foreign licensees. So they submit an application, pass the ethics exam, pay the fees. Renewed somebody else pronounced the word for it. See, now you can't do it either.
Yeah. Never mind.
Never mind that word. And then gives the board the ability to adopt rules.
And just to be really clear, under that foundation, so this isn't brand new language that we cooked up here. This is essentially stuff that I think pretty close exists in statute now. The rule writing authority right now is getting used toward essentially points us to the mutual recognition agreement structure that NASBA has put together, so that if we do have somebody who comes in that's already kind of credentialed from another state, there's really two options, right? One is if they are coming from a place where there is an MRA agreement in place, then we can essentially work through the MRA structure that NASBA has. And if they don't, then essentially they have to apply the same way an initial applicant does, and we have to essentially individually figure out whether they meet one of the what will here be now 3 pathways. If they have, the pieces necessary for them to get credentialed, right? So that's essentially the 2 pathways that we have right now for folks that already hold some kind of a credential outside the US.
Any other comments on 145? Hearing none, a question. We are about 90 minutes into this meeting. Do people need 5 minutes to just stand up and move? I'm hearing yes, I have. Beth has made a motion and seconded her own motion. So let's take a 5-minute break and we'll be back at 10:30 Pacific. So 5 minutes.
All right, thank you.
Martin brought French pastries in today. That's what the calorie stuff's about.
You back being recorded?
Yes, we are.
Perfect. Welcome back, and I think we've got everybody back. All right, so now moving on to section 150. Right spot, I think I am. Renewal of license. And I don't remember how much change there was here.
Don't think, Angie, if I remember correctly, this is really kind of a status quo piece, right? We don't need to spend much time on here.
No, it was just looking at the, just changing the terms from permit and all that stuff. And then the one thing that is different, right, which we've talked about a lot in this group, is that the way that it was written before, if your license expired, you would lose your everything, right? You lose your exam would expire and everything would expire. And so we did that whole process where we had the other we created sort of this other pathway to come back to ask the board to have a license reinstated. This does take out that part so that your exam doesn't expire anymore. Just kind of removes that from there. And I know that was something you guys kind of felt strongly about. So we took that part out.
So if I envision myself in front of the legislature explaining this particular section, I could use the words, it's a kind of gentler version of status quo.
Right.
Questions on 150? 153. So some changes, modifications here. If you hold a license in another state, or what did we change here?
This is the open mobility.
The open mobility where it's open. Hold license in another state, you can practice in this state as long as you're not physically present. If you're physically present, we want you licensed.
Yeah.
So, which is what will change the way you get there, right? Because right now it doesn't actually say that. It says the principal place of business. We had talked about before about how we would change the definition of the principal place of business. And that's one of the definitions we need to change to sort of clarify that, but yes.
So this is kind of really the bigger deal one, and we do need to spend a little bit of time on it, because it's really not even just as simple as saying this is essentially the language that affects open mobility, right? So I want to just say it the other way around to kind of just for clarity's sake, right? Is that up until now, essentially, what practice privileges were based on is essentially the whole concept of substantial equivalency around the country. So effectively what we're doing here is what inside the executive directors group we refer to as decoupling of substantial equivalency from mobility. So there's, when we say open mobility, it's, you know, if you keep it too simplistic, it sounds like, oh yeah, we kind of have this now. It's easy to practice across state lines now, right? But what's really happening here is that we're changing the foundation. And this is really, really important for the current construct, because we have this, you know, we have essentially changes that are starting to emerge around the country in different jurisdictions. That means that there is going to be a upheaval around what is considered substantially equivalent. There is no national consensus on what is considered substantially equivalent once that happens. And so in essence, this is the language that is intended to protect mobility by essentially decoupling it from substantial equivalency and taking that step that we discussed at the last Laws and Rules Committee meeting and at the last board meeting, special board meeting, both in July, that basically says, we want to preserve that ability to practice. And in order to do that, we're now putting it on a different foundation. And the foundation simply is you have a license in another state, right? So that's, I think, just for clarity reasons, that's a really different approach, right? That is also one that there is a significant discussion going on nationally as to where, you know, whether that's appropriate or not. There is, I would say, a significant minority that I'm a part of in the executive directors group that's strongly in favor of decoupling mobility from substantial equivalency precisely to preserve mobility. That's what this approach is. I think from a policy level, I feel comfortable saying to the LRC that this is what was asked for in drafting. This is what the board asked for in drafting. What we need to talk about, and that's kind of one of the bigger decisions we need to make, is, and I think we spent a significant amount of time just discussing it between you and Jason and Angie and I, is this whole issue of, do we need an escape hatch, right? There's a whole, you know, within that lack of consensus discussion around open mobility isn't just the strand of, is mobility per se a good idea? There is a sub-strand of the discussion that's about, if you do open mobility, right? What happens if, and because this is the counter argument to open mobility, what happens if, and as you pointed out so gently earlier on, what happens if the Martin extreme example of lemonade stand CPA licensure, you know, standard for licensure happens in kind of essentially the rogue jurisdiction, right? Do we need that caveat? So there is a policy question for us of, do we want a caveat, right? Or escape hatch, whichever label you want to use. And then full disclosure, you know, as I indicated early on in the meeting, right? I'm trying to stay in touch with a lot of the, you know, thinkers, both in my executive directors group as well as, you know, with Tom Neal, right? And Tom actually came back with a suggestion. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it because it came through late on Friday. Angie, I think you were copied on it as well, that basically says, hey, I have an idea. He essentially gave us draft language that you don't see yet because it didn't come in until after I sent out the materials already. I have, if the committee is interested in an escape hatch approach, I can essentially, because it's not super complicated, convey what that could look like from Tom's perspective. And, you know, I trust him. He's in the midst of all the drafting discussions, policy discussions. So if there's an interest in that, we can go down that road and discuss that as well.
Share that for purposes of
Yeah.
information.
I'm happy to do that. I just need to.
And everyone remembers Tom Neal is co-chair of UAA.
Yes, so Tom Neal is the AICPA co-chair of the UAA committee, and he is also, he has different hats on. He has the AICPA hat on. I think he's also current, I don't know, Jennifer, you may know this better than I do, what his current level of involvement in the Washington Society of CPAs is. I know he's in there, but I don't know if he has a formal role, and I know he's an ex-Washington board member. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anything
I don't
else?
know if he has a formal role on the society, but they do lean on him heavily, and I know he works with them.
Yeah. So the way what Tom wrote late afternoon is, so if you go back up to the very beginning of our language in the 673.153, right? It says a holder under sub 1, so right after the bold part, a holder of a license with a principal place of business in another state may practice public accountancy in the state if the holder has an active CPA license in good standing from another state, right? And then he adds on, so long as the holder at the time of licensure was required to show evidence of having obtained at least a minimum of a baccalaureate's degree, passed the uniform CPA exam, and has at least 1 year of experience. So it essentially like puts in the lowest floor, right? Puts in, you know, essentially a slightly lower floor than our BA level standards to make sure that it can't get too low, if you will, but basically says you're good to go as long as you're licensed in another state, but you can slide in essentially that standard as the extreme bare minimum.
Do you think that would ease national discomfort?
Oh, absolutely. I think it would.
I mean, it doesn't seem like that complicates anything because we're already referencing
Well,
something
okay.
similar above.
Let me rephrase. This is, I said this much too strongly. I think that if a non-agenda based rational individual discussion occurs at the national level, that language will be extremely helpful. I do not think that that's the case right now nationally. I think right now we're going to get opposition for the sake of opposition if we go toward open mobility, no matter how reasonable our language is. But I don't think we should be distracted by that or pay attention to that. I feel like we need to define what our true north is and what we strive for, and then go out there and explain that, right? And that's really what we need this committee and the board for, right? It's fundamentally a discussion of, do you want to put an escape hatch in there to make this more palatable? If so, are you comfortable with that approach that Tom just laid out in email as a potential way to think about that? That's really what we should discuss, and we just need to figure out what our comfort zone is that we go out there with, and not worry about whether we're going to get opposition for the sake of opposition or not.
Amanda?
Yeah, so I think having an escape hatch is always a good idea, just because we don't know and we can't predict what other places might do. But I also think that we can make it more generic than that, maybe. You know, my thought would be if we could say a holder of a license with a principal place of business in another state or jurisdiction, as we decide to use, as approved by the board in rule, may practice. And then in rule, we can just say all states are deemed currently, you know, substantially equivalent, or are deemed, sorry, that is a specific phrase, but are approved. And then if a certain jurisdiction decides to kind of go rogue, we can just say, you know, in rule, then start excluding those who would need to be excluded in the right circumstances.
Angie, what Amanda just suggested, could we do that in rule? Because it would make me a little bit nervous about, you know, if I think through my non-lawyer lens of what we keep hearing from DOJ around rule writing, right? Which is the general principle of you can't give something in rule that is not being given in statute. You can't take something away in rule that is provided for in statute. How far can we go down the line that Amanda is suggesting here?
I mean, I think that's a sort, you know, I could never say, I mean, it's always, you know, it's better to have something in statute, I think in the long run for like, you know, there's different sort of like thinking on that. And I think a little bit of maybe some of the interpretation that's happening for some of the courts across the country are changing a little bit on that. But so I think it is always better to have it in, I mean, because you have to have some sort of authority to do it in statute to get it to rule. I think that Amanda's point is you could probably go there. Could it backfire on us potentially? Yes.
That's the legal answer. I will
Yeah.
say strategy standpoint if I think, Amanda, if I think about going down the road that you're suggesting, right? What I think about from a non-legal, just strictly strategy standpoint, right? Sitting either with a legislator or in a committee hearing, right? It basically means we would have to explain, if we say as prescribed by the board in rule, that we intend to use it as an escape hatch, right? Versus sitting there with language that explicitly provides for one. Does that make sense? So we're gonna have to be a little bit more like, trust us, we will use that rule writing authority to provide for a floor if something goes sideways, is kind of what we would need to say. Does that make sense?
There's also that perception of, hey, the rule can just be changed and everything gone very easily too. You know, whereas in statute, that safety net would remain, but if, you know, I mean, it would take a process to get it out.
It would, yeah, so it's a strategy question for us.
Yeah.
How explicit do we want to be? It's really, that's kind of the way I interpret your question, Amanda, is how explicit do we want to be about the escape hatch, right?
Yeah, I mean, and especially because things are so fluid. I mean, I do feel like, you know, what Tom's proposed is kind of the bare minimum that we would hope that everyone would at least adhere to. But if it didn't, then what? Right? And if we, knowing that it would require then a legislative change to accommodate it, is that something that we are okay with, right? Do we think that that's prudent?
Melissa and Beth, thoughts?
I think it would be great to include an escape hatch, and I kind of like the verbiage that you shared from the other gentleman, Martin.
I would like to go along with what Melissa said. We just can't foresee what a board might want to do in another state, and what if they got rid of the exam or something. And I just want to give Oregon protection against that.
Dominic, you turned your video on. Are you trying to weigh in?
Yeah, he's now raised his hand.
Yeah.
So, and this
Yeah.
is, if I remember right.
No, it's not
Oh, is
Dominic's
it?
language.
Oh, it's not Dominic.
No,
Okay.
Dominic, if you've seen this language, if you've seen this type of language before, but I know, you know, I'm assuming you've thought about open mobility a bit and the whole thing of escape hatch, but I didn't want to put you on the spot about you know, where how far you guys are in California on that issue.
Yeah, so I'll start with escape hatch. What we're calling them is more just trying to, I guess, more marketing in a way from a ledge perspective is consumer protection safeguards. You know, how are we going to potentially offset arguments around just automatic mobility? So to that point, I 1000% agree with the comments made. You with automatic mobility, when you're coming at it new, I would suggest And we have, our board is kind of already has some structure around it, having those safeguards. My one concern with Tom Neal's language, and I don't discount it. My concern is it doesn't do the decoupling that you're wanting. You're kind of decoupling, but then recoupling back in licensure requirements as a means to establish automatic mobility to a degree. And Martin, I apologize, I didn't quite hear all of it, if it was about the state or the individual, when you're looking at that particular.
Was the individual, as long as the owner at the time of licensure was required to show evidence of having obtained at least a minimum of a baccalaureate degree, passed the uniform CPA exam, and has at least 1 year of experience. So it's written as an escape hatch at the level of the individual.
Okay. And to that extent, that's a better approach than some of the other hybrid kind of versions I've been hearing, where it still kind of ties back to the state. So what I can share in California, and again, going back to the decoupling piece a little bit more, is mobility was built around substantial equivalency of licensure, and that was it. And that's a very narrow focus of what I believe regulators need to be concerned about. We need to be just as concerned about whether or not that state or jurisdiction is enforcing their rules and regulations, not just what they did on the front end, but what they're doing on the back end. And so one of the things that California has within our act as a safeguard to really help us is if a state stops doing enforcement, let's say they just issue licenses, but they're not doing any type of enforcement, continuing regulation, requiring CPE, doing certain things, the board can yank that kind of automatic mobility. It doesn't, at least the no notice, no fee mobility component of it. The individual could still try to show some substantial equivalency or do some other things, but the board can pull it back. And we would do the same with if the state went kind of off the rails, in essence, if they did their licensure piece. Again, California and Oregon operate, I don't know how we operate from a statutory construction versus a regulatory construction and how that has to interplay, but the way it's built in California is the board through vote can remove that mobility. It's spelled out in the statute, but it doesn't limit the board in terms of what those criteria could be. It just is, it's kind of a broad-based criteria, things like they stop doing enforcement, they don't do discipline, they might have, we're proposing adding a component of if they have licensure requirements that are too far askew from where California is. And then the automatic mobility goes away. But licensees from that state could still notify us, so we don't disrupt the entire ecosystem of cross-border practice, where the individual may need to notify us that they're practicing here and doing certain things, so that mobility can still happen, but it doesn't destroy it from the sense of if a state goes off the rails, which is kind of what I think is the concern now, or was the narrative being pushed by NASBA and to a certain degree the AICPA early on, related to if one state does something, everything kind of falls apart. And so finding ways to move it from, if the state does that, is there a way for the individual to still be able to operate under some type of practice privileges without interrupting that ecosystem, was also that component that we added to ours. But I think where Martin and your team and LRC is kind of moving is definitely in line with that approach. And then I do agree that some type of safeguards would be great because it sells the message. It gets some of the stuff off of the opposition side of things, that you have a release and you have a safety valve for your consumers and your constituents in your state.
That's really super thoughtful. Angie, it kind of makes me wonder, and I hate to put you on the spot like this, but it makes me really wonder if we could do this really differently and basically say, we've already done all this work around defining the the 3 different pathways in another section of statute, right? And I'm almost wondering if there is, instead of the language instead of Tom's language, could we simply write in authority language for the board to restrict essentially practice privileges if to restrict a practice privilege by rule, right? And then the rule could define whether it's, you know, at the level of the individual or not. If a state essentially goes substantially below the, you know, licensure pathway requirements that we laid out in whatever the number was of that section that where you laid out the three pathways. I don't know if that's cleaner or not, you know, it doesn't like directly. I don't know if that also fixes, you know, your issue, Dominic, but it might be one way, instead of writing in a whole other standard, is to kind of write in some kind of an explicit authority by the board to do something different, to essentially tinker with practice privileges in some way. I don't know, this is a really tough one for me. I think ultimately what I'm hearing from you, Dominic, is that if we were to go down and use the language that's suggested by Tom, that it wouldn't be an ultra heartburn thing. You know, it's a little bit of that coupling it back. I think what you said earlier on, but in a way that isn't a total heartburn. I think is kind of what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, no, I don't see that as being heartburn, especially it's tied to individual, not the state necessarily. Again, I just think there's this added component of it, which is some of the messaging we're using within our automatic mobility is licensure is important. I don't want to minimize that, but the totality of the regulatory structure is just as important to make sure that other things are happening. So that's how we added Martin, I'm happy to share with our existing, I can share with what we're working on, but I can share the statutory construct that we have that allows the board this determining factor around mobility. And I'm happy to share it with you and Angie and your team as you look to figure out what might be a good structure for Oregon. But again, nothing what Oregon has here, or even what you said from Tom, gives me any heartburn. I'm just offering some other thoughts and suggestions.
Melissa, let's see, Melissa commented, Beth, I can't remember if you commented or not. You did, okay. All right, I'll make sure we got it.
Yeah, I think I heard Melissa and Beth agreeing that I think both of you, were in agreement that you liked the language that Tom proposed, is I think what I recall from both of your comments. Amanda, I think you're still, a bit on the fence on that one.
Yeah, so I would say, to Dominic's point, I do feel like it's kind of recoupling what we've tried to uncouple. And so if there was a way that we could give the board authority to restrict, either individuals or jurisdictions if need be, I think that would kind of satisfy that from my thinking.
You know, and I wasn't that in love with Tom's language because it did feel like we were going backwards just a little bit, but I am in love with, we need the board to have the ability to stop things. But I found Dominic's insight into, and we can do it for more reasons, except we haven't tied ours to a state, but if we did tie it to a state, we can do it for more reasons than just, they no longer require the exam. It could be that they got rid of their accountancy board and somebody just issues licenses, but there's no oversight or something. But I'm pretty open to kind of whatever we figure out, just as long as we have some sort of escape hatch.
Yeah, and I don't want to put you on the spot too much here, Sherry, but I'm very cognizant of that this is very, 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 very close to kind of, tinkering with the language that in Oregon has a bit of history going back to the 2009 legislature, right? Which is the one that passed individual mobility into law, right? And I know that's kind of a sensitive topic because that was a little bit of a, a little bit of a more difficult time, at a time where there wasn't a bunch of unity. at the time in Oregon, right? And we've really kind of moved beyond that piece. But I always kind of keep that a little bit in the back of my mind because there is, on the one side of the spectrum is what we just discussed is, hey, can we put some escape hatch on it, some, you know, some protection that if somebody dances out of line, right? But there is the other end of the spectrum is, do we move too far in that direction and begin to tinker with mobility to an extent where, you know, the folks that are really concerned about, hey, we don't really want to move back on anything that we've done with respect to establishing individual mobility going back to 2009, we don't want to concern them. And for that matter, we certainly don't want to do anything that would make TAC concerned.
Does Rachel have any feedback on this?
Yeah, I think it's time to put Rachel on the hot seat. Are you good with that, Jim?
I'm totally good with that. I was being patient. I would love to hear what Rachel has to say.
Yeah, I've just been listening in. I can't say for certainty without bringing it back to Marcus, of course, but from what I'm hearing, I don't see any reason why, as the big firms, we would be concerned with any sort of safe hatch language, right? It's not, we are supportive of automatic mobility, and the language that you had read from Tom, or to Dominic's point, I think any safe hatch that you have to say, if a board goes rogue and eliminates requirements, that type of language, I don't see any red flags from our perspective, because we're still going to be hiring, you know, staff that has met those requirements.
Okay, thank you.
I was thinking about what you were talking about with 2009, et cetera, and you know, it's like this vision of we're going along a path and we can take different, like 3 different exits off the path, right?
Yeah.
Each one. And then in thinking about that, like what were we trying to accomplish and what are we trying to accomplish today? I feel like with this language, it gives us that mobility solution that is all the concern. And I think by having an escape hatch, that also may lessen down some national concerns about complete open mobility, right? I'm not so sure it's going to change any minds, but it certainly gives us an opportunity to say, hey, you know, there's still going to be public protection, et cetera, because of this, if something unforeseen and really wild were to happen. So I'm comfortable with this. I think it's important to have an escape hatch. And, you know, we just want to build things to the point where it all makes sense and it's understandable. So when none of us are in the room any longer, other people can interpret and apply it.
I'm hearing consensus around escape hatch, you know. Jennifer's probably feeling badly because we haven't put her on the spot recently. So Jennifer, do you have any comments as our friend to the north?
I don't have any further comments based on, I mean, we're thinking of all the, you know, Dominic has, you know, said a lot of things that we're even looking at. I think we're looking at the automatic mobility because we're kind of concentrating, I think, at this next board meeting in October, is we're going to really be concentrating on the mobility and the decoupling. I know you guys are kind of both doing both at the same time with your guys' restructure, but for us right now, we are just looking at, because we're able to do everything in rule. You know, House Bill 1920 for us, with the society just had passed this legislation session, has really gave a lot of the flexibility to rulemaking versus having to open up our statute again. So just interested in how you guys are going to be writing it and what you guys are going to be putting forth and seeing what we could use. But there's no red flags for us that says, you know, we have some concerns.
Thank you. So hearing consensus that we should have an escape hatch, let's talk about what that escape hatch looks like so we can give some recommendations to Angie for some additional language in the draft. What should it be?
Well, since we've already established, we're setting in this statute, we're setting mobility based on the individual, not the state, in that we're saying they have a license from a state, but we're not saying the state is substantially equivalent. So focusing on, before I really like Dominic's idea of, you know, if the state stops regulating or something, I'm not sure that needs to be involved here because we're talking about individuals. So I just wanted to say that. I don't have language. I just want to make sure we don't mix the metaphors and have individual and state substantial equivalency happening in the same statute.
I guess my question for, I guess, Angie would be, you know, what do you think the most effective way to do this would be? I mean, is it putting it in, is it just, you know, granting the board the right to offer exceptions to this at their discretion? Or is it something that, does it need to be beefier than that? Does it need to be more specific? Yeah, how do we do this in a way that'll work?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's a hard, I kind of thought like, oh, maybe I just put it in a separate section, like in the same section, obviously, but a separate section altogether that kind of is like a carve out that says, you know, sort of something like to the extent of like, if something, obviously not these words, but if a state goes rogue, the board can basically, you know, not accept substantial or not accept or allow that person to practice here under this statute if done in rules, and kind of like looping back to Amanda, what you had said in the beginning, that sort of like gives a very specific thing that you could put in rules so that they could exempt, you know, certain things out in rule, but like stating exactly what they could exempt. So I could do something like that, or I could do something more generic. I think probably going more specific is the better way. I think that the concern when we were originally, when Jason and Martin and I met, were sort of like, you know, the discussion up until now has been open mobility, open mobility, open mobility, and not wanting to bring to you guys something that had too specific of an escape hatch in it that would scare people and be like, oh, well, here Oregon's going to go change, you know, the initial licensure requirements, and then basically say, okay, well, if you guys go too far and change your initial licensure requirements, we're going to shut you down. Trying to make sure that that is not the message that we send across, right? We want to make sure that we're still sending the message that we do want open mobility. We just don't want open mobility with a state that no longer requires an exam. So, so I think I can probably, you know, work something out that gets us there, but I do think it will have to sort of, you know, go back to what, similar to what California does, where the board can vote on it. Basically, instead of just being that the board can vote on it, the board would do a rule. So then, you know, there's safeguards around that, where that other state could then come in and say like, hey, you know, you guys said we're not doing this right. And they could say, but we are, you know, so that sort of kind of builds in some of those protections as well for the other states, and saying that you do it by rule. Just the way that our rulemaking process works. I don't know how it works in California. So, you know, that kind of would maybe alleviate those fears that other states might have, that Oregon might suddenly say like, no, suddenly now Nevada is not allowed or whatever, you know. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Angie, could we, or this is actually almost more of a Jason question, really a committee question. You know, we could, as a committee, also choose the pathway of simply saying we have a consensus around an escape hatch, that the committee feels that that's important. It sounds like, while not everybody is fully in love with the language from Tom, that we could say, here is one option. Doesn't necessarily, you know, have a consensus. This is one option on how to approach it. And then see what Angie comes up with, maybe after we see the language from California with respect to the, you know, the options for the board to restrict practice privileges, and essentially say, leave it up to the board to kind of narrow it down what the comfort zone is around the specific type of escape hatch. I don't think we have to get to an absolute final answer on what that escape hatch looks like today. I think we can do a little bit of that work with Angie and then at the board meeting in a week from now, and then quite frankly, whatever we then get out of the board meeting and over to the drafter is gonna come back to us again. Right, so it's really more about trying to suss out where is this committee today? Right, if we're fine writing language today on specific escape hatch, let's go do it. If we're not fine with that, then that's also an okay message to send to the board and say, we have a consensus on escape hatch, we're not quite there yet on the language. Here's one option, we're not not super hugging it, but kind of hugging it. Here's another version that Angie's come up with, and then discuss the pros and cons. I mean, we do have a 2-hour board meeting. We didn't just squeeze this into a lunch hour next week. There is an expectation that the board will need to spend some time around this stuff, because it is literally the last time that we have before we need to get all, and Angie, you and I need to talk about this offline, right? Because I also feel the pressure of doing all the other technical, if you will, like trickle down adjustments that we've kind of referred to, that are not about policy changes, but aligning what we're discussing here with how that trickles through in other parts of the statutes, in our definitions, and so on. All of that stuff needs to be pretty ready to go, ideally for the board meeting. And if not, it would have to be done right after the board meeting. I would prefer to have it be at the board meeting so that we can be super transparent about, here is the entire enchilada, right, of all the changes to the Public Accountancy Act that we're asking the board to approve for submission into legislative drafting. And that may be the only section where we give the board more than one option is, if you're okay with that approach, is to say, we're not fully settled on the escape hatch language, right? Here's one option, here's another option, and then we kind of talk through the pros and cons in a week from now.
That language, make sure we have our hand up, that language has to be like spot on, because I kind of like the idea of choices, because it gives a chance to talk through it this week versus I'm kind of looking at the clock, we have 45 minutes. I worry about just rushing that through where this is the consensus of the committee, because, I mean, this part needs to satisfy as many stakeholders as possible, in my opinion, and when I say that, reduce down the tension on some, raise acceptance by some, hopefully. And I really, it's the intention of, why are we thinking escape hatch and what are we trying to do? So it doesn't look like, oh, we're closing off mobility.
Well, and I was gonna say, in addition to Sherry, to what you were saying, it also though needs to do that in a way that also accounts for a wide variety of reasons why we might decide a specific individual really shouldn't have open mobility. And those, to Dominic's point, can be just as much about that board's enforcement of their rules, right, as in certain situations, as it can be other things, right? So we're thinking about nuances, like, let's say, they aren't great about enforcing other criminal activity on a license or something along those types of things, something that would be really unique to a specific individual that we may say, hey, you really don't, wouldn't qualify under our rules. So some of that, like, kind of broad, but yet broadly specific, I don't know. Therein lies the challenge, right? And I guess there isn't some legal equivalent to, we just reserve the right to refuse service to anyone kind of a version. So.
One of my thoughts is, because we are redefining substantial equivalency to be specific to Oregon as opposed to the UAA, right? We could reference, as long as they're substantially equivalent as defined in board whatever, because that would establish that they'd have to have one of the 3 education and experience pathways and an examination. Just a thought. Because then that would change if we changed our definition of substantially equivalent as well. I don't know.
processing that piece because it's consistent with one version of my ideas around when the board could step in and at least choose if they wanted to do a restriction, right? It is also a little bit different than Tom's approach, which I think deliberately took like one slight layer below the three pathways, right? If you look at his language, right, it's actually trying to atone for, there could be, you know, a state that even goes down to a bachelor plus 1 year. Well, we don't really do that. That should be kind of like effectively from his suggestion, like the pain point where open mobility, if it drops below the bachelor plus 1, which is a different standard than bachelor plus 2. That's what I'm pointing out here, right? He's essentially putting in a slightly lower bar for when to start questioning the ability to have practice privileges. He's essentially, I think, deliberately segregating that from the bachelor plus 2 level, which is an interesting way to think about it. So I want to point that out, that we're not talking about exactly the same thing in terms of the two approaches here. I'm a little bit unsettled in my own mind in terms of what I like. You know, your approach, Beth, you know, makes sense to just tie it back, right? But you know, I also like the idea of essentially having some wiggle around the practice privilege piece, right? Which is, I think, what Tom, I think, was indirectly trying to suggest here.
Well, wouldn't that just kind of link it back to substantially equivalent, which is what we're trying to uncouple anyway?
Yeah, I mean, that's the catch-22 that Dominic
Yeah.
kind of restarts the whole coupling conversation, right? That's the uncomfortable part about all of this.
Dominic?
So thank you. First off, I need to hop off here in just a minute, and I wanted to extend my appreciation to all of you and Martin for inviting me and giving me an opportunity. I just wanted to offer one final thought, and Martin, and I think your comments well kind of put in terms of trying to noodle through some of what it is, but I think what you can look at is potentially is mobility right now, and automatic mobility is a state to state kind of trust piece. You know, CPA equals CPA. And when you may need to, at what point the board may need to step in and pull back the state element of it, and that's when it turns into the individual part. And so looking at it from, we are trusting in the state, we're leaning into the state, we're leaning into all those components because we, you know, we have uniformity or whatever, and I think that's oversell, but we have, you know, trust in those other states, CPA equals CPA. The second you take it away, that's when the Tom piece or these other kind of ways to continue to use mobility, but it just has to pivot. And it may not be based on the state, it's going to be based on the individual and their qualification or so on. So that may be one way to kind of parse out where those discrepancies or those concerns come from and what that trigger truly means. The trigger might be just pulling it from the state, but not affecting the individual, and the individual has to do something in order to maintain that ability to practice here, and whatever that is for Oregon and whatever that threshold means for your state. So maybe that's kind of how I'm looking at it now, and some of the pieces that I noodle through, but it's this, I have the same kind of concerns you do, Martin, but that could be just one way to look at it. But again, I need to hop off, and I just wanted to extend my appreciation.
Thank you for your time, Dominic.
Thank you.
Oops.
So we talked about, we wanted a state patch. Not quite sure where to go. Jason Robinson, what do you think of us presenting a couple of options and then the board going through it? Because ultimately, all we can do is say, here's what we think. And then it's you and the other board members who make the decisions.
I think the conversations we've had with the board, I think that they'll appreciate the escape hatch. I think that what you guys are going to present here is in line with what we've been thinking and kind of noodling through on our side. So
are you saying, Jason, from your perspective, getting that credit?
you're awfully quiet, Martin, which is strange, but
Jason, can you mute yourself so when Martin talks, because there's like background noise on yours that's, I think.
So, Jason, I think what we're trying to suss out with your help is, from a board member's perspective, do you think it would work to present more than one option around the escape hatch piece?
I don't know that that's necessary. But having options is always a good thing. It complicates things, and it's already a complicated issue in the first place.
Well, we've got some options on the table. Tom's language. Effectively tie it back to the language we have in 050, which ties to substantial equivalency that we wanted to get away from, but now we're tying it to, but we're trying to get away from.
Yeah.
Or, I think the other thing that was thrown out was have ability in rule.
No, I think that's at least, another option that we talked about is to just kind of have a more generic, board authority where we then have to argue that the board could craft an escape hatch, but there is essentially a bit of the concern whether we can, whether that could come back to bite us with respect to level of authority.
I think, Martin, we could do it in a way that's like, instead of like, so under 673.153, we would add like another, I don't know if I would put it under the bottom or if I'd put it like, closer to the top part, but basically, we could put a thing that says to, basically, this is not the words I would use, but like basically to the extent that another state goes rogue and gets rid of a requirement that is important to the Board of Accountancy, the Oregon Board of Accountancy, the board can by rule, not allow licenses from that state or something like that.
For restrictive practice.
Right.
From a particular.
Right.
And basically not as a broad punishing the whole state, but essentially doing it at the level of the individual, which is.
Yeah, I mean, we could write it either way, and then that way you're explicitly saying the board has the ability to do that in rule. So then it's not just like kind of like trying to like make it as part of subsection 1 that is like, would make the language of the statute easier, right? But it would not be nearly as defensible as saying like explicitly somewhere in this portion of 153 where we say the board can write a rule around this stuff if it needs to.
Okay. Well, I think.
And do you need an example of what that would look like in rule?
In the statute, you mean, or do I generally need?
No, if we're presenting that, we could make an adjustment in rule. Do we need to set like it would look something like this?
I don't think so. I don't think we would necessarily need that in the statute, but I can, I can come up with that, and then if the board hates it, or we get some sort of feedback, that other people don't like it, we can go back to the sort of more simpler model of, Tom's language or something like that. That isn't basically saying you can take it out in rule.
So what I'm hearing you say, Andrew, is that you would be excited to help us draft this version that you just described?
So excited.
As at least one option, because I'm kind of hearing here, and Jason, if you hear this, I'm kind of still, I think, hearing that the committee is okay with putting more than one option on the table for the board, is I think kind of what I'm hearing here.
That's what I'm hearing. And then Jason, what I'm hearing from you is options are good. Board can decide, and if nothing else, the board may choose one, or the board may come up with a commingling of a couple of those that it feels most comfortable with. Sure.
Is that a work session or is it a regular board meeting? Thinking about public comment.
It is not a regular board meeting, it is a special board meeting, so that's the way it's going to get noticed. But it is very much, you know, it has one primary purpose. That board meeting is really around this piece. I don't know that we specifically call it a work session. I have to, I'm trying to remember what I wrote into the agenda draft that was just approved by Joe as we were talking. It effectively is one.
You know, I'm just
So
thinking
we
more about
can,
public comment.
oh yeah, there's public comment. People will be at the table. We might even have some folks coming into the board meeting that may not be so excited about what it is we're doing.
So I think we have direction. So let me ask a couple of questions. We spent a good amount of time talking about the escape hatch. Is anyone uncomfortable presenting 2 or 3 options to the board on Monday and then letting the board's gonna make final decision anyway, as they should. Anybody have a concern about presenting a couple of options to the board and then letting them think about it and come up with something in that special meeting? Any concerns? Hearing none. We've been through, and again, thank you, Angie, for the draft. I like what's written. It's simpler. To me, it's more clear. Are there any concerns? Or maybe I need to ask for a formal. Okay, I'm getting a yes. So may I have a motion to present to the board on Monday the draft 673 sections as they have been presented and discussed in this meeting? I see a Melissa move. Seconds.
I second.
Seconds. All in favor? Any additional discussion?
Just for clarification, Mr. Chair, that motion would include still the ability to have more than one option
Yes.
presented for the escape hatch piece.
Any discussion?
I move that we present what we've discussed as well as have Angie present a couple of escape hatch examples.
Thank you. I have a clarified motion. Second.
Second.
Motion seconded. Any additional discussion? All in favor, aye.
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 Any opposed, nay. Any abstentions? Motion passes. Good work. With that, I think the board is set for its meeting on Monday to walk through this. Is there anything else that we need to do for the board to be prepared for that meeting?
I don't believe so. Not in that, not for that board meeting.
So our next meeting for the LRC would be subsequent to legislative council drafting, is that correct?
Ideally, if we can pull the committee together, quickly enough, that's essentially the idea. I now know from my experience with the other legislative concept that when the formal draft comes out from legislative council, that there is a strict, I think it's either a 14 or a 15-day window in which there has to be a response that needs to be provided to legislative council. Now, I want to manage expectations here, right? The unknown is, it's now, okay, what is known is today's the 19th of August. We know that it will take us at least until the 26th of August to get stuff, because that's when the board meeting is, to get stuff into Leg Council. I don't think it's realistic when I just look at the timing of it all. I think it will take the full 2 to 3 weeks just for Leg Council to do draftings and backs and forths, which means that by the time we get a first draft, that's actually like, okay, here's the formal proposal by Leg Council to draft the Public Accountancy Act. I suspect strongly that at that point in time, the window we will have for responding to it will include the time of our regularly scheduled September 26th board meeting. So there's only two versions that I can think of right now, process-wise, and it's a little hard to predict, right? But I think it's important from managing expectations by the committee. Essentially, it means if we get that formal first draft back early on in that window, like with sufficient lead time to schedule a meeting of this committee, and sufficient time to then get, sufficient time to schedule this meeting, then I think it would be great to move to have the LRC in it. That I think should be our default, right? But if we're put in a position where we don't get stuff from Leg Council until like the week of the board meeting, then I think it will become impractical to do another kind of go round with this group. So I think if you're good with that, Jason, is that if the timing window works out, that we have enough time to schedule an LRC, I think it would be great to get that feedback at the LRC level. I just can't promise the committee will get quite that lucky.
Just depending on timing, and I'm comfortable with that. So it may move directly from Leg Council, Jason, to you at the board.
Should we preempt that and schedule an LRC meeting the week of the 16th?
I mean, we could, yes, absolutely. I mean, preempted in the sense of, I can't guarantee what Leg Council will do and when, but preempted in the sense of we're ready to go and have something in the books, absolutely. We can do that.
Not the 16th itself, please.
Not the 16th itself, no.
Sorry, tax guy in the room.
So what Jason's really saying, what he wants is like the 17th at 8 AM in the morning.
I'm good with that, but yeah.
No, but seriously, what shall we talk about a little bit? What will work for the committee?
I cannot do the 18th, 19th, or 20th.
Well,
So that's the 17th?
Hang on a second, let me actually pull up my calendar here.
Strategic planning.
Sorry, my allergies are just really getting to the happy place here.
17th truly is fine.
Is really fine.
That's fine.
Do you want to try something on the 17th from, I don't know if it's enough for us to just do a lunch hour thing, just for an hour. Shall we do that? Shall we try for that? 17th at lunch at noon?
Yeah.
And see if we already have something by then, because then it will give us a little bit of, that gives us just enough time to get something into board meeting materials with any feedback. I could schedule a tentative one very easily. And maybe that one will do Zoom only.
Yeah. Make that make sense.
Does that work for everyone?
Bring your own lunch.
Cannot guarantee that I will not continue to eat French boulangerie cookies in front of you. All right, awesome, great idea. Thank you, Jason, for that.
So I think that's the future meeting. Anything else before we adjourn? Hearing none. I now adjourn this public meeting of the Laws and Rules Committee. Time is now 11:36 a.m. Please stop the recording. Thanks, everybody.